When you live on a large piece of land that's been in your family for generations, you get used to a certain rhythm of life. You wake up, sip your coffee on the porch, maybe tend to chores, maybe just watch the sunrise burn off the morning fog. Out here, my nearest real neighbor is half a mile away, and even then, you'd hardly know they were there unless you squinted. For decades, this land had been a sanctuary, not just for me, but for the animals I was licensed to care for. Yes, animals. Not dogs or horses like you might expect on a ranch. Not even cattle. No, I'm one of the rare people in the entire state with a federal and state permit to house and care for grizzly bears. It sounds crazy, I know. Most people picture them as snarling beasts fit only for the wilderness, but under the right conditions and strict regulation, they can be kept safely. My grandfather started the program years ago, back when wildlife rescue centers needed reliable private caretakers. When he passed, I inherited not just the land, but also the responsibility and the bears. There are 3 of them. Daisy, the oldest, a female with a scar across her muzzle from her days in the wild. Kodiak, a massive male who outweighed the rest of us combined. And little Ember, born in captivity, never having seen the forest except through the steel bars of a transport crate. They weren't pets, not by any stretch. I didn't cuddle them or let them roam the house. But I cared for them, provided food, medical treatment, enrichment, and most importantly, a home where they could exist without being hunted, exploited, or put down. Anyone who really knew me, or respected property lines understood this. Unfortunately, the local HOA was not anyone like that. You see, the neighborhood that had sprung up about a mile down the road wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. Originally, this was agricultural land, zoned strictly for farming and ranching. But a slick developer got his hands on a few parcels, cut deals at the county office, and before long, Pinewood Estates appeared. A collection of oversized houses stuffed shoulder to shoulder, each with just enough grass to mow on a Saturday morning. Those homeowners formed an HOA within weeks, as if the first order of business was to control every soul within shouting distance. I didn't buy into their community, didn't sign their contracts, didn't attend their meetings. Why would I? My land wasn't part of their subdivision. I'd been here before their cul-de-sacs had asphalt. My family had deeper roots than their imported sod. Yet they behaved as though the entire valley fell under their jurisdiction. Letters stuffed into my mailbox demanding I trim unsightly vegetation on the edge of my driveway. A notice telling me to reconsider the dangerous animals they had heard rumors about. And the most laughable, fines. They actually tried to fine me. I ignored most of it. Arguing with people who never stepped foot on your land was a waste of oxygen. Still, I knew it was only a matter of time before they escalated. That day came in the most unexpected form, a picnic. It was a Saturday morning when I spotted the first sign something was off. A line of SUVs and minivans crept past my gate, tires crunching gravel, drivers waving as though they belonged here. At first, I thought maybe someone had made a wrong turn. GPS around here could be unreliable. But then I saw more cars, then trucks, and then, unbelievably, a banner being hauled out of one of the vehicles. Pinewood Estates annual community picnic. My stomach dropped. They hadn't rented a park. They hadn't set up at their own clubhouse. No, they had decided, without asking me, that my land was the perfect place to host their little gathering. I stood frozen on the porch, coffee in hand, watching in disbelief as people I'd never met unloaded coolers, folding tables, and lawn chairs directly onto my front pasture. Children were running around, tossing frisbees dangerously close to the outer perimeter fence, the same fence behind which Daisy was lounging in the shade, watching the commotion with curious amber eyes. And the parents. They weren't concerned at all. They were too busy stringing balloons and setting up grills. It hit me then, they had no idea. No clue that beyond that chain link fence were 1,200 pounds of raw muscle and teeth. No inkling that the beautiful open land they thought was unused was actually licensed wildlife habitat. The sheer arrogance stunned me. Did they really believe every square foot of the valley belonged to them? That they could just march onto private property and plant their tents? I set my mug down and grabbed my phone, intending to call the sheriff before this spiraled into a disaster. But before I could even unlock the screen, a voice called out from the crowd. There he is. The landowner. Heads turned toward me. A woman in oversized sunglasses and a sun hat, clearly one of the HOA board members, waved her hand like we were old friends. Don't worry, she shouted across the field. We'll clean everything up when we're done. Her tone wasn't apologetic. It was dismissive. As if she were doing me a favor by announcing the intrusion. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Yelling would only inflame things, and besides, the last thing I needed was someone calling me unstable. But what they didn't understand, and what I knew all too well, was that this wasn't just trespassing. This was dangerous. Because if one of those kids managed to climb the wrong fence, if one soccer ball bounced into the wrong enclosure, if one oblivious parent decided to wander too close for a selfie with the pretty brown bear, this picnic could turn from potato salad and hot dogs into a headline on the evening news. And so, with a tight jaw and steady steps, I started walking down toward the field, ready to confront the crowd that had no idea how close they were to a very real nightmare. I walked down the slope of the field, boots crunching dry grass, my shadow stretching long in the late morning sun. By the time I reached the crowd, several families had already spread out blankets. Someone had a speaker blasting cheerful pop music, and the smell of charcoal drifted in the air as a couple of men fired up portable grills. It could have been any idyllic suburban gathering, except for the fact it was happening illegally on my land. Excuse me, I said firmly, voice carrying over the chatter. A few people turned. Most didn't. One man actually raised his red plastic cup to me like I was just another guest. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder this time. Excuse me. This is private property. That got their attention. Heads turned, conversations stilled. The woman in the sun hat, who I now recognized as the self-appointed HOA president, Mrs. Carver, strode toward me with a smile plastered on her face. Oh, don't be silly, she said in a syrupy tone. This land is perfect for the picnic. You've got so much space. We're not hurting anything. Her words weren't just dismissive, they were entitled. As though my boundaries, my rights, didn't matter because she decided otherwise. You are trespassing, I said, keeping my voice steady but hard. I didn't give anyone permission to be here. You all need to leave. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Some looked uneasy. Others crossed their arms, clearly siding with Mrs. Carver. She laughed lightly, waving her hand. Oh, come now. We're neighbors. This is community spirit. Surely you don't mind us borrowing the space for just one afternoon. Borrowing. My jaw clenched. That word alone told me everything about how she viewed the situation. To her, my land wasn't mine. It was a shared resource she could lay claim to whenever it suited her. I said, locking eyes with her. This isn't borrowing. It's illegal trespassing. And you're putting everyone here in danger. That last line made a few heads snap up. A father holding a toddler frowned. Danger? What do you mean? I pointed toward the chain link fence less than 50 yards away, where Daisy had stood up, her massive body shifting with slow, deliberate movements. She wasn't agitated, just curious, her nose twitching at the smell of grilled meat wafting through the air. The crowd followed my finger, and when they saw her, a collective gasp rose. "Is that a bear?" someone whispered. "Yes," I said. 3, actually. They live here. Legally. I'm licensed by both the state and federal government to house and care for them. But they are wild animals, and they are not pets. That fence is there for a reason, and your picnic is far too close. The father holding the toddler instinctively pulled his child tighter. A young boy dropped his soccer ball, which rolled a few feet toward the fence. Mrs. Carver, however, didn't miss a beat. Her smile faltered for just a second before she plastered it back on. "Oh, don't be dramatic. That fence looks sturdy enough. And they can't possibly be dangerous if you're keeping them here. Besides, the children are having fun." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Was she really brushing off a 1,000-pound predator, as though it were a golden retriever? Grizzlies are apex predators," I said sharply. "Even through a fence, they are dangerous. And if any of your kids climbs over or throws food at them, things could turn ugly fast." A few parents began gathering up their things, clearly rattled. But others stayed seated, as though waiting for Mrs. Carver's permission. She raised her chin, her voice carrying. "He's just trying to scare us off, because he doesn't want to share. This land is sitting here unused most of the time. It's selfish not to let the community enjoy it once in a while." That statement lit a fire in my chest. Selfish. My family had poured blood, sweat, and decades into maintaining this land, not just for ourselves, but as a sanctuary for creatures no one else wanted to deal with. I paid the taxes. I followed the regulations. I carried the responsibility of ensuring no one ever got hurt. And here she was, dismissing it all, because she wanted her HOA picnic to look good on Facebook. I took a step closer, my voice dropping low, but sharp as glass. "If you don't start packing up right now, I will call the sheriff. And when he arrives, every one of you will be cited for trespassing." That finally cracked the crowd. Some people started folding up chairs. A couple of moms hustled their kids toward their minivans. The speaker clicked off, leaving only the sound of wind and distant bird calls. But Mrs. Carver wasn't done. She squared her shoulders and hissed, just loud enough for me to hear. "You can't intimidate us with your fake threats. Those animals are probably illegal, and I'll see to it that animal control removes them. Then let's see how high and mighty you feel." The sheer ignorance made me laugh, a sharp, humorless sound. "Go ahead," I said. "Call whoever you like. I've got every permit and license in order. You'll only embarrass yourself." For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. But she quickly turned back to her loyalists and clapped her hands. "Fine. We'll go. But this isn't over. You can't hide behind those fences forever." As she marched off, the last of the cars began pulling away, leaving my field littered with footprints and trampled grass. I stood there, watching until the dust from their tires faded. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. Daisy had settled back down, Kodiak lumbered lazily in the background, and Ember pawed at a log, oblivious to the human drama that had just unfolded. But I knew Mrs. Carver's threat wasn't idle. She wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She'd be back. And next time, she'd bring more than just picnic baskets. For the rest of that day, the ranch was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. Daisy lumbered back into her den, Kodiak stretched out like an oversized rug in the sun, and Ember continued swatting playfully at her log, utterly indifferent to the human storm that had just blown through. But I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I'd dealt with enough stubborn people in my life to know Mrs. Carver's threat wasn't hollow. She'd tasted embarrassment, and people like her, people who thrive on control, hate nothing more than losing face. Sure enough, the very next morning, I heard the first shot across the bow. The county animal control truck rolled up my driveway around 10 a.m. 2 officers stepped out, clipboards in hand, their expressions professional but tense. "Morning," one of them said cautiously. "We received a report about exotic animals being housed on this property. Do you mind if we take a look?" I almost laughed. Exotic animals. As though I were hiding tigers in the basement. But I kept my cool. "Not a problem at all. I've got all my paperwork inside. You're welcome to see the enclosures too, on the condition you follow safety protocol." The officers nodded. They weren't the enemy here, they were just following up on a complaint. Together, we walked the perimeter. I showed them the reinforced fencing, the double gate systems, the warning signs posted every 20 feet. Daisy peeked out of her den as we passed, huffing softly, but otherwise calm. Ember was nosing at her water trough, while Kodiak gave the officers a long, slow look before flopping back down with a grunt. When we circled back to the house, I laid the paperwork across the hood of their truck: state permits, federal licenses, inspection reports, veterinary records, the whole arsenal. The younger officer raised his eyebrows. "This is thorough. Honestly, your setup's better than most sanctuaries we've seen." "Exactly what I told the inspector last spring," I replied evenly. The older officer sighed, scribbling a note. "We'll file our report. You won't have any trouble from us." He glanced at me, lowering his voice. "But whoever made this complaint, they'll probably try again." I didn't need him to say who. I already knew. Sure enough, within days the phone calls started. HOA members leaving messages about how dangerous it was to house grizzlies so close to a residential community. Letters appeared in my mailbox, unsigned, of course, demanding I do the right thing and surrender the animals. One even threatened to take matters into our own hands if I didn't. That one chilled me. Not because I thought they had the guts to scale a 12-foot electrified fence, but because their arrogance blinded them to how quickly they could get themselves hurt. I decided it was time to get ahead of this. I called the sheriff myself. He came out that afternoon, a broad-shouldered man with a drawl slow as molasses. He'd been in office for years, and we'd crossed paths before at town meetings. "Heard you had some excitement with Pinewood Estates," he said, leaning on his cruiser. "You could call it that," I replied dryly. He chuckled. "Look, I know these HOA types. They think property lines are just suggestions. But between you and me, they don't have a leg to stand on. You've got your paperwork. You're in the clear. I'll make a note in our system in case they try to stir up more trouble." I thanked him, but I also knew paper and permits didn't mean much to people like Mrs. Carver. She wasn't after legality, she was after control. And sure enough, a week later, she upped the ante. It started with flyers. Brightly colored, printed on glossy paper, taped to mailboxes and community boards all over town. Big bold letters screamed across the top: "Danger in our community." Beneath it was a photo of Daisy, taken through the fence at an angle that made her look like she was about to pounce. The text below painted me as some kind of reckless lunatic, harboring aggressive predators, within walking distance of children. When I saw one of the flyers stuck to the window of the feed store, I tore it down on the spot. My blood boiled. Not only was she lying, but she was inciting fear, weaponizing people's ignorance of wildlife to turn the town against me. The problem was, it worked. I noticed the stares when I went into town for supplies. Conversations hushed when I walked past. Even folks I'd known for years gave me wary looks, as if I were the one who'd crossed the line. Mrs. Carver, meanwhile, strutted around Pinewood Estates like she'd already won. I heard from one of the contractors, who sometimes worked my fence line, that she was boasting about taking care of the bear problem once and for all. It didn't take a genius to figure out what that meant. And that's when my real worry began, not for myself, but for the bears. Because I knew Mrs. Carver's type. If she couldn't push me out legally, she'd try to stir up enough panic that someone would do something stupid. And all it would take was one idiot throwing something over the fence, one kid climbing where they shouldn't, or one drunk HOA member deciding to prove a point after dark. The bears would defend themselves. They always would. And if that happened, no amount of paperwork would protect them from being destroyed as dangerous animals. That night, as I sat on the porch listening to the crickets, I made myself a promise. I would protect Daisy, Kodiak, and Ember, not just from the outside world, but from the ignorance of the very people who thought they knew better. And deep down, I knew something was coming. Something bigger than flyers and gossip. Something that would force Mrs. Carver, and her little army of rulemakers, to confront the reality of what they were messing with. The calm before the storm lasted less than 2 weeks. I'd been on edge the whole time, watching the perimeter cameras, checking the locks on the enclosures twice a day, and making sure Daisy, Kodiak, and Ember were well fed and enriched. The last thing I wanted was for them to get stressed, because a stressed bear is unpredictable, and unpredictability plus angry neighbors was a recipe for disaster. Sure enough, the storm arrived on a Saturday evening. I first noticed it when the motion sensor lights near the eastern fence flicked on. My phone buzzed with the alert, and I pulled up the camera feed. There they were, 3 figures in dark hoodies creeping along the fence line, flashlights bobbing in their hands. Even without seeing their faces, I knew who they belonged to. No one else would be stupid enough to be skulking around bear enclosures in the dead of night. I grabbed my boots and shotgun, not loaded, but loud enough when cocked to make a point, and headed out. The crunch of gravel under my feet carried through the quiet night, and as I approached, the intruders froze. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I barked. One flashlight jerked toward me, blinding me for a second. Then a familiar voice rang out, "Mrs. Carver." "We're documenting evidence," she declared. "These animals are a public menace, and we're going to prove it. Once the county sees this, they'll have no choice but to shut you down." I lowered the gun barrel to the ground, planting it like a staff. "You're trespassing. You need to leave now." But she didn't back down. Instead, she gestured toward the enclosures. "Look. They're dangerous. You can see it in their eyes." As if on cue, Kodiak lumbered out of the shadows, drawn by the voices. At over 1,000 pounds, his presence was thunder on paws. He stopped just inside the fence line, huffing, his eyes glinting in the beam of their flashlights. Daisy followed, slower, more cautious, but no less intimidating. Ember scampered up behind them, standing on her hind legs for a better look. The 3 intruders stumbled back a few steps. For the first time, I saw real fear in Mrs. Carver's face. "These fences won't hold forever," she stammered. "It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." I stepped between her and the bears, planting my boots firmly in the dirt. The only people in danger here are the ones stupid enough to trespass at night and taunt wild animals. But before I could herd them off the property, the worst happened. One of the men with her husband, I guessed, pulled something out of his bag. A raw steak, wrapped in butcher paper. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. He tossed it over the fence. Time slowed. The meat hit the ground inside the enclosure with a wet slap. Kodiak's head snapped toward it instantly, instincts kicking in. He barreled forward, jaws clamping down with a sound like breaking bones. Daisy snarled at him, lunging for a share, and Ember squealed, caught between wanting to join and not wanting to be crushed. The enclosure erupted into chaos, fence rattling, snarls echoing, the sheer raw power of 3 bears fighting over food. The intruders screamed, stumbling backward in terror. Mrs. Carver shrieked, "They're attacking! They're attacking! No, you idiot!" I roared. "You just triggered a food fight." But they weren't listening. They bolted toward the road, tripping over each other in their panic. By the time I calmed the bears with distraction feed, dumping barrels of meat and fruit to redirect their frenzy, the damage was done. The trespassers had their evidence, shaky phone footage of Kodiak slamming against the fence, and Daisy roaring like a thunderclap. I knew exactly how they'd spin it. And sure enough, Monday morning, the video was plastered all over social media. Mrs. Carver's caption screamed, "See? Proof these animals are a threat to our children." The comment section exploded, half the town crying out for justice, the other half calling the HOA lunatics. By noon, local news vans were parked on the roadside. Reporters angled their cameras toward my property, eager for a soundbite. I didn't hide. I stood tall on my porch, permits in hand, and when they asked me for comment, I gave them the truth. They trespassed. They taunted wild animals. They threw meat into the enclosure to provoke a reaction. And when the bears did exactly what nature programmed them to do, they screamed danger. My bears are not the problem. Human stupidity is. The clip went viral. And for once, the tide turned. Neighbors who had doubted me saw the permits, saw the evidence, and realized I wasn't the reckless madman the HOA painted me as. The sheriff backed me up publicly, confirming the trespass and the provocation. Even Animal Control released a statement: "The bears are housed legally and securely." The incident was caused entirely by human misconduct. By the end of the week, the HOA was in full retreat. Lawsuits flew, against them, not me. Trespassing charges were filed. And Mrs. Carver. She was voted out as HOA president after an emergency meeting. Her once loyal followers finally tired of her obsession and the embarrassment it caused. As for me, life on the ranch went back to normal. Daisy healed from a scrape she'd gotten in the food scuffle, Ember grew a little braver, and Kodiak, well, Kodiak was just as ornery as ever. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching them move through the twilight, and I think about that night. About how close ignorance came to costing lives, human and animal alike. And I remind myself of one simple truth. This land isn't just mine. It's theirs too. And no HOA, no banner-waving Karen, and no amount of gossip will ever change that.